This is lecture 12 for POS 273 International Relations, an online undergraduate course taught at the University of Maine. I'm your instructor, Rob Glover. So today's lecture is on international political economy. It's kind of a new side of international relations. We've talked about the economy, we've talked about globalization, but we haven't yet delved into the substance of how we became a globalized economy and what some of the actual steps were through which that process happened. So over the next few lectures, we're going to dig into that. So what we'll cover today, first we'll define international political economy. We'll talk about what it is. We'll ask the question of how the contemporary global economy came to be. We'll talk about major impacts of something called the Bretton Woods system, which you might not be familiar with right now, but you'll become more familiar as we start to talk about the global economy and its evolution over time. And then lastly, we'll return to the theoretical perspectives that we talked about at the outset of the class and ask how certain theoretical perspectives that we've already covered might look at the growth of the global economy and how would they explain it? How would they try to understand the kind of causal mechanisms that led to the creation of a global economy? So, what is international political economy? First off, we often refer to this as IPE. So when I'm using that acronym, this is what I'm talking about. International political economy at its core really refers to the interplay between states and markets and global affairs. So the key thing to realize is sometimes we talk about the state and then we'll talk about the market. We talk about them as if they're these separate entities. So the state is the government, the leadership, policymakers. The market is the realm of business. It's the realm of consumers and producers, labor, and sometimes even in domestic politics, you'll hear an individual say, well, we need to let the market decide on this. This is like the debate over health insurance, for example. Some of the folks who are critical of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, were saying we think the best solutions are provided by the market, not necessarily the government. And that rests upon a distinction between the realm in which the government is making decisions, our policymakers are crafting policy, and then there's the market in which consumers and producers are making decisions about what to buy, what to sell, what to produce, what the price should be. How much of a good should be available. And that's really a false distinction. It's particularly a false distinction once we start talking about the international level. That distinction between states and markets kind of breaks down. What you'll realize as you delve into IPE is that there's really no such thing as a truly free market. That's another term that you'll sometimes hear. You'll hear a politician or an analyst or a pundit say, I support the free market. Well, find a free market. Find a market in which economic producers and consumers are operating without any government involvement whatsoever. It's impossible. It doesn't exist. So we can talk about varying degrees of government regulation, varying degrees of government involvement in the economy, but the idea of a truly free market, there's no such thing. In fact, the societies that have anything close to a free market are generally kind of societies in which government has broken down. They're failed states. At some place like, Somalia or Afghanistan, you might have something like a truly free market. But in general, most advanced economies, and certainly the global economy as a whole, there's this interplay between the government and what the economy is doing. And so it's this realm of interaction as opposed to this entity in which things are separated in that way. And then lastly, IPE alerts us to the fact that economic outcomes do not just happen absent involvement and collaboration by states and international organizations. Again, this is particularly true at the international level. It's very, very hard to ship a good around the world and make it available for sale and consume that good if there isn't lots of interaction along the way by states and international organizations to collaborate to ensure that the good gets where it's going and it is in fact available for sale. We have lots of frameworks for how we send things around the world, how we produce products, labor, those sorts of things. So there's always government involvement. There's always, when we're talking about an international good, a global good, there's always the involvement of international organizations. There's lots of hard work and collaboration and planning that involves a global economy. It doesn't just happen, okay? So types of things that are part of IPE. These are topics that we could cover if we wanted to really dig into international political economy. And this is important stuff. This, the world that you live in today, the comforts, the enjoyment, the patterns of consumption, your job, all of the things that we experience as part of the economic realm would not be possible without all of these various dimensions. So what are the things that comprise international political economy? First and foremost, we're talking about trade and the exchange of not just goods but services across borders. What's sometimes called imports and exports. No country in the world today has the ability to produce everything that they need within their domestic borders. We rely upon other economies, other producers outside of our national borders to get things that we need and want. So all of that requires coordination, and international political economy involves looking at the coordination. How does it happen? How does the economy, the global economy, function so seamlessly a lot of times that we don't even realize that, you know, the avocado that we're buying comes from a different country and is subject to all sorts of restrictions and regulations and passes through all sorts of hands before it gets to us. All right. Also talking about regulation and restriction of goods and services. There's all sorts of ways in which we might want to regulate or restrict a certain good or certain services. It could be health and safety. We could have certain restrictions with regard to labeling or how a product is packaged. We might just say certain goods are not going to come into our country. This happens periodically with agricultural goods. If we're unhappy with, not completely comfortable with the ways in which beef is being produced in a certain country, we might introduce some sort of temporary restriction on beef from a certain country. This happened with Japan relatively recently, in which there were certain restrictions to ensure that the meat that we were getting was safe, and we weren't convinced that the Japanese government was doing a good enough job of enforcing those restrictions, and so we put this kind of temporary ban upon Japanese beef from coming into the U.S. economy. But this happens on a daily basis. There's all sorts of ways in which we regulate and restrict goods. Doesn't just have to be health and safety. Sometimes this happens as a result of broader political imperatives. Sometimes this is a diplomatic move. So we talked about one of the ways to enforce international law is through trade embargoes and not doing business with certain countries. And so, until just recently, we had a trade embargo with Cuba. We've had economic sanctions and a trade embargo with Iran. So sometimes the regulation and restriction of goods and services has nothing to do with the products themselves. It has to do with the policies of the countries from which the goods and services are coming. So looking at those sorts of activities would be part of IPE. Anytime we're talking about things that you produce, obviously someone is making them. There's a labor force. And so looking at labor and the global workforce is part of IPE. We look at the ways in which products are produced and the patterns of investment and what are called global commodity chains that result in finished products ending up in markets for sale. I'm going to show you a video clip in just a minute about global commodity chains. So I'm not going to talk about that too much right now, but basically it just refers to the various steps that a product has to go through from raw material to finished product on the shelves for sale to consumers, which depending on the sophistication and the level of what they call value added of a good, it can be fairly significant. You can be dealing with products that have landed in 40 or 50 countries before you're actually buying the final product. Another part of this is international finance and banking. So we have a global financial system. We have banks that operate in virtually every country in the world. And all of that is part of IP, how money flows around the world, where money goes, where money is centralized, where money does not go, right? That's part of this. Intellectual property rights, this refers to things like patents, copyrights on certain goods. It could be on certain processes, certain ways of making goods. And one of the big challenges as we've developed this global economy is ensuring that the protections that we take for granted in our own countries carry over to the global economy. So we have, if you develop a product, if you develop a pharmaceutical good or a piece of technology, even a way of producing something, there's U.S. patent law. You can file a patent with the U.S. Patent Office, and provided that they approve it, you have a pretty good assurance that that is going to be protected and somebody else isn't going to steal your idea and then try to make a profit off of it. Much harder to enforce at the international level, and there have been some really remarkable cases recently where intellectual property rights, a country's failure to enforce intellectual property rights has resulted in pretty severe rebuke from the international community. Believe it or not, Russia, I believe this was in 2007 or 2008, Russia had problems with its application to become part of an international organization called the World Trade Organization because of their reluctance to enforce copyright laws with regard to entertainment. MP3s and movies and all these things were available through Russian websites, and they weren't really cracking down on any of this. They knew that this was happening, and so there was a real response from powerful private entities, corporations that didn't want to see their goods basically given away for nothing, and also countries that said, we can't have a country that decides that it's not going to enforce copyright protections on movies and music and all other forms of intellectual property. And this has happened in a number of different countries. There are countries that are notorious for not really rigorously enforcing intellectual property rights on a host of different goods, and it's led to big international disputes over intellectual property. And then lastly, and we don't get into this so much this week, but we deal with it next week, economic development and poverty alleviation. So we live in a world that has, in the aggregate, more wealth and more prosperity than we've ever seen in human history, but the inequality is really striking. And there are areas of the world in which the vast majority of the population doesn't have the basic commodities that they need in order to live at even kind of a subsistence level. And so that has been a central point of the international community, is how do we ensure that people have access to prosperity, and there's a path for countries out of poverty and out of all of the secondary effects with regard to human health and stability and conflict and education that come with being impoverished. So that we start to dig into more next week. But all of these things, right, all of these different dimensions are part of international political economy. They're part of that interplay between the quote-unquote state and the quote-unquote market. Okay, so we're going to watch a clip now to put some of this into perspective. The clip is about Walmart, and specifically it's about the modes of production that Walmart uses in order to get a good or a product from its actual sites of manufacture to the shelves where you might purchase it in your local Walmart. Now the clip that you're going to watch is produced by a union, and it has a certain angle. It's very critical of Walmart. Walmart is not a pro-union company. One of the ways in which they've made their goods so cheap is by saving on labor costs, both at the production end, the manufacturer end, but also retail employees. And so this comes from the perspective of a North American union that is very critical of Walmart's anti-union policies. But I'm not so much concerned about that. That's not what I want you to focus on. What I want you to focus on is the incredibly intricate and truly global way in which Walmart's products get from point A to point B, or realistically from point A to point Z, because there's so many different stops along the way, and it's such a complex process. So I show you this clip to give you a sense of kind of how production and retail, even things that we take for granted, are truly global in scope. So we'll watch this clip and then I'll come back a little bit and talk about it.
This t-shirt is on sale at Walmart in the USA at an incredible $5.97. How is this price possible? Made miles away from the shop, shipped around the world, stored in a warehouse, and then onto the shelves of a store. Of course, Walmart is a giant. It's the world's biggest retailer and the third largest employer. In the USA alone, Walmart has more than 4,600 stores in which 130 million people shop each week. And around the world, every second, 400 people shop at one of the 10,700 stores that Walmart has in 27 countries. Walmart had revenues of $466.1 billion in net sales in 2012. How can Walmart stay at the top with that extraordinary profitability when it's selling t-shirts at $5.97? Let's begin by having a look at a Walmart store in the USA. The average hourly wage of the workers that sell this t-shirt is $8.81, which translates to an annual pay of $15,576 based upon Walmart's full-time status of 34 hours per week. This is significantly below the federal poverty level. Here we have a first hint. And what about benefits? If you're a part-time employee, which most Walmart workers are, you don't get any healthcare coverage by the company. Walmart holds another record on this. It is the employer that has the highest percentage of workers having to rely on government assistance, thus receiving more than $1 billion per year in subsidies from the U.S. taxpayers. Faced with these conditions, don't Walmart workers in the USA complain? They do, but every worker who speaks out faces instant retaliation measures, ranging from disciplinary hearings to hour cuts and even dismissal. But let's get back to the journey of our t-shirt. Walmart is the largest mover and seller of goods in the world. Most of the goods sold at Walmart in the US are made abroad. When arriving in the country, they're stored in giant warehouses run by third-party contractors hired by Walmart. Agency workers and day laborers work inside these warehouses in an extremely stressful and dangerous environment where injuries and accidents are common. They're paid very low wages tied to a piece rate system, receive no benefits, and face retaliation if they report injuries or complain about conditions. And what do we find if we follow the t-shirt back to its place of origin? Walmart's supply chain comprises more than 100,000 suppliers and millions of workers. The company's purchasing practices aim to get the maximum flexibility and the lowest prices from its suppliers, who in order to do business with Walmart, pass on these pressures to their own workers with very poor pay and often dangerous working conditions. Our t-shirt is made in Bangladesh, the world's second most important garment producer. Bangladesh textile workers are among the lowest paid in the world. 60 to 80-hour work weeks, no overtime pay, no health care, and illegal subcontracting are common. Workers who speak out about these conditions and try to organize regularly face intimidation, dismissal, and even violence. Walmart is the second largest buyer of garments from Bangladesh, a country where more than half of textile factories are vulnerable to collapse, and fires with fatal consequences have become commonplace. After the largest factory fire in the history of Bangladesh, in which 117 workers died, Walmart explicitly refused to pay more to upgrade Bangladeshi factory buildings. And even after the deadliest industrial accident in the history of the world, when the Rana Plaza building collapsed and 1,129 people died in horrendous circumstances, Walmart refused to join a large number of global companies that signed a legally binding agreement to improve building and fire safety in Bangladesh. Perhaps our $5.97 t-shirt was made right here at Rana Plaza? That would mean that Walmart is a top company because it aims to cut costs at any price across its giant supply chain and stores, without any consideration for ethical standards or social responsibilities. And this certainly doesn't only affect those supplying and working for Walmart. With its size and reach, Walmart is dictating standards that affect workers in all industries and all around the world, leading the global race to the bottom for working conditions. Taking on a giant.
Okay, so I'm going to stop there. After that, the video kind of goes into a pitch for this union. But the key thing that I want you to understand there is that the products that we buy, particularly kind of the low-cost products that we buy from major chain stores, but really a healthy chunk of consumer products that are available for purchase in the United States are a product of a global commodity chain. So the global commodity chain refers to the full kind of chain of processes and steps that take a good from its raw state, it's the raw materials that make up a good, to when it's finally produced for when it's finally available for sale on the shelves, and the consumer is actually kind of touching it and buying it, which, as the global economy has changed, has become truly kind of worldwide in scope. You saw that the vast majority of China's products are being produced in China. That would not have been conceivable 30 or 40 years ago. There have been changes in technology, changes in law and domestic policy, changes in our trade practices that have enabled that to be the way that the global economy is organized. So the key thing that I want you to think about when you're considering IPE and you're actually engaged in consumption is that we live in a globalized economy, you know that, but it doesn't just happen. It requires extensive coordination, it requires what is sometimes difficult coordination, and for our economy today, for our global economy, that takes place at the international level. We're talking about international coordination. So globalization, we sometimes talk about it in this abstract way, as if it, the technology emerged and then it just happened. But it has been the process. It's been a process over time that has involved lots and lots of international cooperation, and that's the core of what international political economy looks at: is how does that cooperation happen? So we need to think about economic globalization as policy, right? It's not just a thing that kind of fell down from the sky. It's a product of policy decisions. Some of those policy decisions happening at the domestic level, right? Policy decisions that make it possible for Walmart to pay its workers, its retail workers, such a low wage, or policy decisions that give Walmart an enormous amount of power vis-a-vis our domestic economy. But a lot of it is happening at the international level. A lot of it is, the scope of production and the scope of this commodity chain is simply too big to be controlled or regulated simply by domestic policy. So we're talking about policy decisions that are happening at the international level. What are some of those policy decisions? Well, economic globalization would not be possible without government investment, and government investment in specific areas. Technology, right? The internet is a good example, satellite technology, these sorts of things make economic globalization possible. And all of those things were a product of strategic government investment. The government saying this is an important strategic initiative and we're going to back it with government money. Government investment in communications, government investment in shipping. A lot of this investment initially happens in the military and then carries over to non-military uses. This is nowhere is this more true than the airline industry. Basically, much of the core technology today that you use in commercial aviation, when you get on, a Boeing 747, you're basically getting on a plane that a lot of that technology, a lot of the hardware was initially developed for the U.S. military and then carried over to commercial applications. So it begins with strategic government investment, and these are the key sectors in which it happened: the tech sector, communications, and shipping, and it's still happening. Collaboration between governments to draw down barriers to trade. The big one is tariffs, right? A tariff is simply, it's like a tax that's placed on a good that's being imported to a country. So say, we have Florida oranges, and then we have oranges from South America, right? If we have a tariff on goods from a certain country in South America, that means that there is just a cost to import that good into the United States. And we still have these. They exist in all sorts of different, very specialized settings, but tariffs refer to those costs that we place to import a good. It's generally done to protect your domestic industry. If you have a strategic industry that you want to support and you want to protect that industry from outside competition, you'll place a tariff. In the 1980s, we had pretty significant tariffs placed on Japanese automobiles because they were producing quality automobiles at a low price, and the American auto producers couldn't compete. And so we started to introduce tariffs in an effort to protect our domestic auto industries and protect those jobs and protect the viability of those cars, of those car manufacturers. So tariffs refer to that. In order for these sorts of globalized economic chains to work, tariffs have to be low. It doesn't make sense if there's significant tariffs that are going to be imposed upon your goods when you try to bring them into another country. But barriers to trade can be other things. Barriers to trade can be all sorts of restrictions. It can be health and safety restrictions. It can be labeling restrictions. It can be restrictions on certain types of goods that have gotten approval in the country in which they're produced, but haven't yet gotten approval in the country that they're being imported to. So there's all sorts of different barriers to trade, but tariffs are the big one. And a lot of hard work has gone into driving down tariffs so that goods and services can flow more easily across national borders. It also requires a truly global finance system, right? So if you're going to have companies like Walmart operating at the international level, they transcend national borders. They have stores in 27 countries and distribution hubs in a whole host of different countries and manufacture hubs in all sorts of different countries. They need to be able to get access to credit. They need to be able to store their money in different locations throughout the world, and that money needs to be able to move easily and without very much cost, right? And so we've had to create that. That requires international coordination. And then international regimes. Regimes, remember, in international relations, when we say regime, we just mean an issue specific area of law. And we have had to, as globalization has happened, develop regimes in all sorts of different areas: labor policy, environmental policy, how we dispose of waste, all sorts of different things. We have to try to craft international law and then get countries to sign on to that. Otherwise, international economic activity that is global in scope becomes very hard when you're operating with 30 or 40 or 100 different domestic systems of law. We've had to craft the international law around this emerging globalized economy. So the key thing that I want you to understand is that globalization, when it comes to the economy, is something that is made. It is not something that just happens. It requires active collaboration between different national governments, different private corporations, different international organizations, etc., etc., etc. There's a whole host of different actors working to make this happen. Even something as simple as sending international mail. When you send a letter to your friend that's studying abroad in Italy, the amount of international collaboration that goes into that letter getting to its destination intact is pretty significant. So even something as simple as the mail requires all sorts of international collaboration. So don't fool yourself into thinking that we develop the technology and then economic globalization happens. If only it were that easy. It's a lot more complex and it's a lot more political than that. One of the things that when we think of technology, technological innovation, and economic globalization, we tend to think of the internet, right? That's the first thing you think of. Okay, I want this sweater that I saw when I was in Ireland on vacation. I didn't buy it. I've regretted the decision. I go on the internet. I find the store in which I saw it. I order it. I pay a lot for shipping, and it comes to me, and I get my thing, right? It's more complicated than that. Internet is only one piece of technology. One of the biggest technologies that you might not actually think about playing a huge role in economic globalization is shipping. And there have been remarkable innovations in shipping in the last 50 or 60 years, to the point where the amount of trade, the amount of commerce, the amount of global interaction that happens today probably could not be possible if we had not made these innovations in shipping. So I'm going to play you this clip that goes into the evolution of containerized shipping to give you a sense of some of the technological innovation that sometimes we don't think about when it comes to globalization.
In 1956, a ship retired from the Second World War was rechristened the SS Ideal X. On her first voyage, she left Port Newark, New Jersey. 5 days later, she arrived in Houston, Texas. On board were 58 large metal boxes. Today, we would call them containers. In Texas, they were loaded onto 58 trucks and whisked off to their various destinations. It was the birth of modern container shipping. The idea seems so simple today, yet it revolutionized the shipping industry and with it the global supply chain. Globalization as we understand it today simply would never have existed without it. This is what a port looks like before containerization. This is Sunda Kelapa in Jakarta. Even today, many ports don't have the facilities to accommodate large container vessels or the dockside equipment to unload boxes at speed. This is how a modern port looks today. Metal containers have transformed the loading process. Boxes are moved on and off ships by special cranes in a matter of minutes. From the port side, they are transferred to rail or truck. Container ships are getting bigger and bigger. Today, the largest transport not 58 metal boxes, but up to 18,000. Some ships are 400 meters long and 59 meters wide. The only constraint is the size of the port and the width of the Malacca Strait.
I mean, if you think about globalization, if you think about world trade as it exists today, with the ability to source products from all over the world, the ability to manufacture and produce in locations without transport costs being a huge obstacle. I mean, that is the miracle that containerization has brought about, the ability to move things around without having to really worry about the cost.
Without containers, China wouldn't be the factory of the world. Containers don't only transport finished goods. These days, supply chains are ever more complex. Components can be shipped from multiple countries, assembled in China or elsewhere, and sold in Europe or America. There have been major battles over the size of containers. At first, there were dozens of incompatible sizes. Gradually, the industry has agreed standards. These days, most big boxes are 20 or 40 feet long. Something like 90% of all non-bulk cargo is transported on container ships. Altogether, container boxes make some 200 million journeys a year. In 2008, the BBC painted a container in a special livery and tracked its movements with a GPS system. Its first consignment was whiskey, transported from a Glasgow bottling plant to Shanghai. In Shanghai, it was reloaded with cosmetics, gardening tools, and tape measures. From there, the BBC box went to Los Angeles via Yokohama, travelled by rail and road to Pennsylvania, where it was loaded with ink, spearmint flavouring, and polyester fibre. Then it was sent to the port of Santos in Brazil. After that, among other destinations, the container went on to ports in Singapore, Bangkok, and right here in Hong Kong. It sounds like a crazy ride. In fact, it couldn't have been more normal. David Pilling, Financial Times, Hong Kong.
Okay, so containerized shipping, if you've ever had the opportunity to actually see a container ship unloaded, it's unbelievable. There's a few ports in the United States. I was in Seattle a few years ago, and I was getting dinner, and we were right on Puget Sound, and there's a container ship port there, and you can watch these gigantic cranes unload container ships very, very quickly, and it's just absolutely stunning. And the really remarkable thing about containerized shipping is that, as the video suggested, this was discovered basically by accident. It was discovered by taking some spare parts left over from World War II and kind of seeing if this would work. And as soon as they did this, they realized, yeah, this is incredibly efficient, and this will, if we scale this up, this will drastically increase the volume of goods that we can ship around the world. So this happened in the 1950s. Prior to that, shipping goods was incredibly labor intensive because of the ways in which you had to load and unload ships. It took a long time. Ships would stay in port for days and days and days being unloaded. This automated the process to such a point that it became, it required a lot less labor, and it could be done much more quickly. As soon as governments realized the capacity of containerized shipping to increase the volume of global trade, they started making conscious policy decisions to support it. And what we have seen over time is just a vast increase in the volume of international trade. Of the top 50 ports in the world, so top 50 ports for containerized shipping, top 50 container ports, 6 of them are in China. 9 of them are in East Asia. 6 in China. We have Singapore, we have Hong Kong, South Korea. The only container port in the top 10 that's not in East Asia is in the Middle East. It's in the United Arab Emirates. The largest container port in the United States is in Los Angeles. Second largest is Long Beach. But they really pale in comparison to the volume that is coming out of China. China is basically the manufacture center for the world at this point. And Shanghai, which you saw in the video, is the #1 port, container port by far. There's just an absolutely stunning amount of goods being shipped out of Shanghai every day. So you'll hear people talk about, the ascendancy of China and the ascendancy of the Asian economy. A lot of it is driven by this capacity for cheap manufacture with low labor costs and the incredible revolution that was brought about by containerized shipping. So we definitely reside in a global economy. We know that, right? We hear that endlessly. I want to talk a little bit about how the global economy came to be. And as I said at the outset, it is not by accident. The starting point for the contemporary global economy really is at the close of World War II. World War II is starting to wind down. It's about 1944, and the major powers on the Allies side are beginning to get a sense that they're definitely going to prevail in Japan. We're talking about a two-front war, right? So they're definitely going to prevail in Japan. It will probably take a little while, but they're pretty convinced that they'll win that war. And they're pretty sure that Germany will be defeated in some form, right? So they know that the eventual outcome of the war is that the Allies are going to win it. And they start to think about, okay, what needs to take place to ensure that we don't have a World War III, to ensure that we're not simply going into these massive, deadly, destructive conflicts every 20 years or so. And a big part of this is the economy, right? You think about what happened in the interwar period, the period between World War I and World War II, the Great Depression happened. And the Great Depression introduced all sorts of human suffering. It made countries susceptible to the type of extremist, expansionist rhetoric that we saw in Nazi Germany, in fascist Italy, in other places in Europe, right? And so they said we need to get the economy under control so that we don't have these huge, booms and these huge busts in which everything falls apart and societies become unstable. So they meet in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, at the Mount Washington Hotel to discuss the global economy. And this is probably one of the most significant international meetings of the 20th century. It establishes basic principles for the post-war economy. What is the world economy after World War II going to look like? And it establishes some very important international organizations. It is basically the beginning, the starting point of the globalized economy that we know today, that we experience every day today. It begins at Bretton Woods. Obviously, there's other things happening. There's innovations happening in technology. There's innovations happening in communications. But without the institutions, without the organizations to coordinate all this activity, we would not have the same scale of global trade and global economic interaction that we have today. So there's basically three core objectives to this conference. The first is to draw down tariffs and barriers to international trade. As countries' national economies began to suffer during the Great Depression, domestically, they were trying to figure out what to do. All of a sudden, all these countries are being hit by just this wave of despair. There's a Great Depression, and they're thinking, okay, how do we respond to this? A lot of countries responded with tariffs. They were trying to protect their domestic industries by making the costs of outside competitors, foreign competitors, making them higher, making their goods more expensive relative to these domestic goods. We did this in the United States. We had something called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, in which we introduced these huge tariffs on foreign goods in an effort to protect our domestic industries, in an effort to keep American workers working and keep American businesses thriving. The effect of all that, the effect of all these different countries introducing tariffs, was to drastically shrink the scale of global trade and drastically shrink the variety of goods that were available on global markets. Right? If you make other countries' goods more costly, they're much less likely to trade with you. Their products are much less likely to be available within your borders. So we had built up these tariffs, we had built up other barriers to trade during the Great Depression and World War II, and the Bretton Woods Conference wanted to break them down as much as possible. Another concern when you're dealing with international trade is the currency system, right? So maybe you've traveled abroad and you've been to places where they have a different currency. You've probably been to places with a pretty stable currency. Maybe you've traveled in Europe and you're using the euro, or you've been to Japan and you're using the yen, right? But not every country in the world has a stable global currency. You don't necessarily want to trade in all your US dollars for Cuban pesos, right? That's not necessarily something you want to do, because those are not valued in the same way that the US dollar is. The US dollar, we know that it's going to retain its value. We know that it's relatively stable. We trust the US government to make sound economic decisions. We don't necessarily trust other countries to do the same thing. So once we start to deal with international trade, we have to decide what is going to be the medium of exchange. And there's a variety of different currencies from which one can choose. The US dollar, the British pound, the euro, the franc, the Deutschmark, at least at the time of the Bretton Woods Conference. Now, pretty much all of Europe has switched over to the euro. But there are a variety of different currencies. And so one of the objectives of the Bretton Woods Conference is what is the currency going to be? What are we going to turn to as the sound currency that's going to retain its value, that we trust, that when we go to do business with a entity from another country, we're going to trade in that currency system. So we have to establish that, okay? Third point, Europe is destroyed. Europe is completely ripped apart. World War II was incredibly, incredibly destructive. There's huge swaths of Europe that prior to World War II had been thriving, had been industrial centers. What do you do when you're engaged in warfare? You target the industrial centers, right? That's part of the war machine. So Europe's industrial base is pretty much destroyed, and we need to figure out how to rebuild it, because Europe at this time is one of the key industrial economic centers in the world, and it has been ripped apart by war. So there needs to be some sort of plan for dealing with the reconstruction that's going to have to happen in the aftermath of World War II. Those are the objectives, right? That is what is on the agenda at the Bretton Woods Conference, which is a pretty significant agenda, right? There's a lot to deal with there. So what do? There's a number of important steps taken in the Bretton Woods Conference. Pretty heavy leadership from the United States. The United States emerged from World War II, at least among the Allies, as kind of the core international power. The Soviet Union attended Bretton Woods Conference, was not largely interested in what was happening there, primarily because what the Bretton Woods Conference was establishing was the groundwork for a global capitalist economy, right? And the Soviet Union is not a capitalist economy. It did not have a capitalist economy. They had a Soviet command-style economy. So they're not really interested in much of what's being discussed at the Bretton Woods Conference. So these were the steps that they took. They established some international organizations, two in fact. The International Monetary Fund. The function of the International Monetary Fund was to oversee that international monetary system and to ensure that there is a stable reserve currency, so that when countries, entities, economic actors from different countries want to engage in international trade, they know what the currency is going to be. The currency that emerged as kind of the front runner at the Bretton Woods Conference was the US dollar. And for a time, from the end of the Bretton Woods Conference until 1973, the US dollar was actually backed in gold. If a foreign government was holding US dollars and had any concern whatsoever about their value, about this currency isn't stable, we don't trust that it's going to retain its value, they could exchange their US dollars for gold from the United States government. That was the basic arrangement. It never happened. There was never, a run on gold because people weren't confident that the U.S. dollar was a stable currency that was going to hold its value. But the promise was made until 1973 that could be done. Okay. So this means that the international system has a reserve currency. People can trade with one another across national borders, and they know what the terms of exchange are going to be. They know what currency they're turning to, right? It establishes a system of exchange that enables all that economic activity after World War II to take place. Second big piece is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IBRD. This is a bank that was set up to provide assistance rebuilding those areas that were destroyed in World War II as its primary goal, and fostering development in underdeveloped regions of the world. So they also recognize at the Bretton Woods Conference that there are a lot of countries that were under colonial rule. Those patterns are going to be changing. We're already seeing movements for independence. We're already seeing the likelihood that we're going to have many newly independent countries trying to establish themselves and trying to pull themselves out of poverty. And so how do we help them develop? How do we help those economies grow? That's the second piece of what the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development is supposed to do. Primarily, the assistance and rebuilding is focused on Europe, not solely, but primarily. There was less support for Japan. Japan had to kind of follow a different path for its rebuilding. That was another society that was pretty much completely destroyed in the aftermath of World War II. There's also something called the Marshall Plan that you're probably familiar with. That worked in tandem with the IBRD. There was a massive, massive effort and lots of money thrown at Europe to rebuild, because the United States and other major powers recognize that this is our major trading partner. If we don't help them rebuild, the global economy looks completely different. So a huge effort to rebuild Europe. And then lastly, something called the Global Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This was originally supposed to be another international organization. There was going to be something called the International Trade Organization, the ITO, and it was going to be an international organization with a function much like the IMF and the IBRD. It would enable trade liberalization through cooperation and multilateral negotiation, and they would gradually draw down those tariffs and non-tariff barriers to trade that had been built up. There was resistance to the idea of an international organization on trade, and it largely came from the United States, largely came from the United States Senate. You had United States senators saying, we don't like the idea, after we've just emerged from a depression and then a world war, of getting wrapped up in an international organization that might be able to dictate the terms of how we emerge from World War II and what our economic recovery looks like. We're in a position of power. Our industrial center was not destroyed by World War II. We're producing a lot of the technology and consumer durable goods that the world is relying upon. We don't understand why we should tie our hands with this big international organization. So the international organization didn't happen. What happened was an agreement, basically like a piece of international law, in which the countries that were party to the Bretton Woods Conference agreed to the Global Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT. And they agreed to meet in a series of rounds to try to draw down these trade barriers that had built up over time. Basically, how are we going to deal with this issue of these tariffs and these barriers to trade, and the fact that international trade has shrunken to a third of what it was prior to 1933, prior to the onset of the Depression. We're going to get together in rooms and talk about it and work through this so that we can begin to have goods flow more easily across borders. Okay. So this is an agreement. It's not an international organization, and there wasn't support in the United States for creating an international organization to deal with trade, but there was support for the Global Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or what's sometimes called the GATT. All right. The long-term impacts of this system are massive. Europe, given the scale of destruction in Europe, given how completely flattened most of the major industrial centers and most of the major urban areas in continental Europe were in the aftermath of World War II, it is rebuilt very quickly. The IBRD provides a lot of support. The Marshall Plan provides a lot of support. Billions and billions of dollars in aid that the United States funnels into Europe, recognizing that if Europe isn't rebuilt, the economy, the global economy, can't grow, right? So there's strong U.S. leadership here and lots of monetary support for Europe to rebuild, and they do so pretty quickly. The IBRD then really is left without a core function of its mandate, right? So it was set out initially to deal with rebuilding. Rebuilding happens at a very quick pace, and so all of a sudden it's like, what is the mission of this organization going to be? It morphs into something called the World Bank, right? And the IBRD still exists, and it's a part of what's called the World Bank Group. But the World Bank's mandate has shifted much more to that secondary piece. It deals with global development, it deals with poverty alleviation, it deals with going into countries that are underdeveloped and suffering from poverty and trying to figure out ways that economic growth can be spurred in those societies. It gives out pretty large loans at relatively low interest rates to these countries, and usually focuses on infrastructure projects. They do a lot of stuff with dams, with infrastructure for roads, infrastructure for clean water, these basic kind of things that in a developing country, we take this for granted in the United States, but in a developing country, they might not have access to those sorts of things. And so they'll provide huge, huge chunks of money that developing countries wouldn't have access to on their own and aren't going to get from private investment in an effort to bring on these projects, right? So that's kind of the first piece. The IMF, it functions very well and provides that international currency stability, that medium of exchange that we need to engage in international trade up until 1973. And then this system collapses. It collapses unilaterally, and it collapses because President Nixon, the United States president at the time, says, we're not going to support this anymore. We're not going to guarantee foreign governments that if they want to exchange their US dollars for gold, they can do so. Primarily, the reason that they were doing this was because there were so many US dollars in circulation that if there was ever a crisis of confidence in the US dollar, if they ever said, we don't trust what's going on in Washington, and we think there's, inflation is too high, and we're concerned about what's happening here, there wouldn't be enough gold in the world. I mean, not enough gold exists that we could actually make those exchanges. And everybody knew it. And Nixon kind of feared that the whole facade of being able to exchange your US dollars for gold would come crumbling down, and had threats from various foreign leaders that they didn't have faith in the US dollar and were thinking about going and getting their gold. That would put him in a very tricky situation. So the United States president took this currency exchange system and basically torpedoed it. And what has replaced it is a floating exchange rate system, right? So you've probably seen this at work. If you've traveled abroad and you've gone to a currency exchange and you see all of the different rates for whatever the local currency is, how much local currency you'll get in exchange for your own currency that you're holding, that's a product of that floating exchange rate system. Basically, money today, currency, functions like any other commodity. Its value fluctuates according to people's confidence that the value is stable and it's going to hold its value, and its desirability when people want it. Right? When people are demanding a certain currency because they think it is a valuable currency, that's what determines the value of currency. That's why currencies fluctuate. And if there's distrust or lack of faith in a currency, you can see the currency value fluctuate wildly relative to other currencies in the world. So this is kind of mind-bending to think about. Because so much of our society revolves around money and its value and its importance, but really the only thing today holding your money, holding any value with your money, is people's faith that the money is what it purports to be worth, right? It is entirely a social construction. There is very little tangible basis for money being worth what it purports to be worth. It's people's faith that the money is worth something. Because this system had collapsed, because Nixon had backed out of this US dollar, the dollar standard, right? The IMF is kind of left without a mission. It's similar to what happened with the IBRD. It had this core function, and all of a sudden that core function is gone. So the IMF morphs into a lender of last resort for countries in financial crisis. You've probably heard about the IMF recently with what's happening in Greece. The Greece economy is in a tailspin. They had an arrangement that was worked out with the IMF, the EU, and various other countries to engage in certain domestic policy measures so as to be available for loans from the IMF, these short-term, very, very large loans. That's the sort of thing that the IMF does. If there's a country that is in crisis and needs access to huge infusions of lots of money so that it has a reserve currency and it can engage in international trade, that's when the IMF comes in. Greece is kind of interesting because it's a relatively well-developed country in Europe. Usually the places in which the IMF is doing business are places like Latin America, Central Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, very lesser developed economies relative to Europe or the United States. But that is their role. That is the role of the IMF today, is they provide these infusions of cash for countries that are going into a financial crisis. They try to stave off that crisis, okay? The last piece, the GATT, has had incredible impacts driving down barriers to global trade. We're going to look at some of those in a second, and that is the kind of core piece of our next lecture on trade and finance. But the GATT is remarkably successful at driving down the barriers to global trade that had emerged in the Great Depression and then in World War II. And eventually, remember how we said that the GATT initially was supposed to be an international organization. It ended up just being an agreement. It eventually becomes an international organization. The GATT evolves into something called the World Trade Organization, the WTO, in 1995. And the GATT remains a part of the World Trade Organization, but the World Trade Organization now has a much larger mandate than simply driving down tariffs. So let's look at some of the things that happened with the GATT. The way that the GATT works, so it's an international agreement. It's similar to the Geneva Convention or the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, right? It's just a piece of international law that countries sign on to at its inception. And the GATT operates in a series of trade rounds. So basically countries get together, member countries get together and negotiate to draw down tariffs and barriers to trade that have emerged over time. And they try to figure out, what are the tariffs that we're going to attack? What are the tariffs that we're going to draw down? What are the conditions that we individual countries want to place on removing tariffs? What do we want our adversaries to in the negotiation to draw down in exchange for concessions that we're going to make? So there's a series of trade rounds. This takes you right up to the Uruguay round, which was in the 1990s. The end of the Uruguay round resulted in the formation of the WTO. These are usually named after places. They're named after the places in which they're held. So you have a number of trade rounds happening in Geneva, but then Tokyo round, the Uruguay round. They're also sometimes, they'll have a couple different names. Like the 6th trade round in Geneva was known as the Kennedy round. The 5th was known as the Dillon round. Those are named after people, right? But you see the features of this, right? You start off drawing down tariffs, and there's a massive initial tariff reduction in 1947, and then gradually they start to expand their mandate to other things. It starts with those tariff cuts, dealing with a lot of the tariffs that had built up in World War II. All of a sudden we're shifting to further tariff reduction, but also things like customs duties and all of these non-tariff barriers to trade. And that's really where the WTO jumps in. Now we're at a point in which a lot of the tariffs that exist in world trade today are pretty negligible. So the WTO is dealing with a more complex agenda than simply drawing down tariffs. That's relatively easy. Now the WTO is dealing with things like intellectual property rights, the movement of goods across borders, and regulations and restrictions that are put in place, which can have the same effect as a tariff. They can make shipping goods into a country prohibitively costly if you introduce lots of restrictions and lots of barriers in terms of how a product is packaged, or what type of container it needs to come in, what type of labeling it needs to have, things like that. But the core function is driving down tariffs, and at that, the Global Agreement on Tariffs and Trade does a pretty remarkable job. You see, at the point at which the GATT is signed in 1947, the world average tariff was about 13%, right? And this fluctuates over time. But when you think about a world average tariff of 13%, basically what you're saying is that if a good is imported into a country from another country, there's a 13% added cost simply associated with the fact that it's an imported good, right? So if I buy a Ford Focus, that's going to cost me, 100% of the purchase price. If I buy a Toyota Camry and the tariff rate is 13%, it's going to cost me 113% of the purchase price, right? So that can have a negative effect on global trade and the ability of goods to flow across borders. And what we see is that gradually, incrementally, over time, they start to draw down this tariff rate to the point where today we have gone from 13% to about 4% is the world average tariff rate. 4% on most purchases is pretty negligible. You're not necessarily going to notice a difference in the purchase price, particularly if all of these changes, like containerized shipping and technology and lower labor costs, if they're enabling companies to have a relatively cheap product. You're not going to notice the 4% difference. You might if you're making, purchases in a pretty significant volume, but it's not going to be prohibitively expensive for you to purchase a good that was produced outside of the country. So in that sense, the Global Agreement on Tariffs and Trade does a pretty remarkable job at facilitating global trade and creating this globalized economy that we have. You also see there RTAs, right? Those are regional trade agreements. So alongside these global negotiations over tariffs and trade happening at the different trade rounds, you're also having individual countries work out regional trading agreements. So you've probably heard of NAFTA, right? The North American Free Trade Agreement. That's an example. That's 3 countries getting together and figuring out ways that they can have greater exchange of goods across their borders. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of regional trade agreements between 2 countries, 3 countries, an entire region, 15 countries, right? So there's been a lot of collaboration, a lot of negotiation on this issue, and that is what has resulted in the tremendous, tremendous flow of goods across borders and a truly globalized economy, alongside those other things, alongside technology, alongside communications innovations, all those other things. But a lot of what drives international trade is sitting down in a room with representatives from another country and hammering out the fine details of trade agreements and what concessions you're willing to make and what you'll get in return. And that's what the GATT and now the WTO has been over time. All right, so how would you analyze this if you wanted to adopt different theoretical perspectives that we've talked about in this class, and you wanted to look at Bretton Woods and kind of the groundwork that Bretton Woods established for the global economy? How would you look at it, and what would you see happening? Of what is this an instance? Remember that question at the outset of class, of what is Bretton Woods an instance? And the different theoretical perspectives would have really, really different takes on what happened at Bretton Woods. For realists, this is power politics, right? You have an agreement that dictated the terms of the global economy, reached as World War II is winding down, and largely dictated by the major military powers that were winning the war, right? This is basically to the victor go the spoils from a realist perspective. The United States, the UK, countries like France, they get a system which overwhelmingly reflects their interests and their strategic goals, right? And they get to dictate the terms by which the global economy will be constructed. It's like if you had a baseball game and you had the absolute best players and they got to decide the rules that you were going to play by in the game. They got to rewrite, even though baseball has a set of very elaborate rules, they got to rewrite the rules, and they did so in ways that gave them even more of an advantage against the less powerful, less skilled players. That's what realists would see happening. This is it operates very much similar to the way that countries behave in warfare, except they're doing it with institutions, they're doing it with legal mechanisms, they're doing it with the creation of international organizations. They would see this as a strategic move designed to enhance power. Liberals look at it completely differently, right? Liberals look at the creation of the Bretton Woods organizations and everything that happened at Bretton Woods as a recognition of the futility of power politics. They see this as international cooperation, countries coming together, admittedly with leadership from the major powers, but coming together to engage in cooperation and to make sacrifices. If countries were simply doing whatever they want, they would be kind of skeptical of some of the sacrifices that they have to make in order to be part of these agreements and to be a member of these organizations. But liberals say countries and country representatives are willing to accept those sacrifices in order to get the peace of mind and the advantage that comes with stability and that comes with solving our disputes through negotiation and compromise as opposed to warfare and conflict, right? And all of the institutions which emerge out of World War II, not just the Bretton Woods institutions, but the United Nations, the international agreements that emerge in the aftermath of World War II, are part of that recognition that power politics is pretty limited, and power politics can be incredibly destructive in the modern era. Constructivists are going to approach it from a completely different angle. They would look at Bretton Woods as a setting in which meaning was created and norms were generated. Remember, norms are collective expectations of behavior. And this is basically what, anytime you create a piece of law, a piece of international law, an international agreement, or an international organization, you're creating norms, you're creating collective expectations. And so constructivists would look at this and say, Bretton Woods is fascinating. All of a sudden we decided what the international currency was going to be, and we gave it value. We imbued it with some sort of importance and meaning that didn't exist before. How do we analyze that? How does that happen? How do we take something like that and try to figure out what was the process by which that meaning was created and those norms were generated? And there's a whole host of different ways in which you could look at Bretton Woods as really a change in the international order, a change in the expectations associated with the international system. How did that happen? The Marxists are going to look at it from a different angle, primarily focused on economic resources and materialism. And Marxists tend to be pretty critical of the Bretton Woods organizations, even to this day. We're going to get into this a little bit over the next few classes, but the Bretton Woods organizations, particularly the WTO and the IMF, are incredibly controversial because of the power that they wield in the global economy and the ways in which the major wealthy countries in the world can shape the agenda and the actions of those organizations. So Marxists actually kind of look at the Bretton Woods conference and the subsequent institutions and organizations that grow out of it in a similar way to the realists, the only difference being that they're not just focused on power, they're focused on economic power. And so they look at the Bretton Woods conference and say, well, this is a system that was set up, and it reflects the interests of the wealthy powers who are setting it up, and it doesn't really benefit the lesser developed countries. There isn't a lot of input from lesser developed countries, and subsequently, as these organizations have existed and evolved over time, that hasn't changed. They haven't gained power to control what very important organizations like the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO do, right? So it's still largely dictated by the interests of the wealthy, and it serves them. It serves their interests, and it facilitates and even possibly increases a divide between the world's wealthiest countries and the world's lesser wealthy countries, right? The lesser developed countries that don't have as much. There's a divide in terms of resources and actual wealth, and that translates to a divide in terms of political power, and a divide in terms of their ability to shape the agenda of the global economy. So they see inequality as the core function of Bretton Woods, and maintaining that inequality is what the organization was set up to do. So that's a starting point. That's a starting point for talking about the international political economy. We delve into this in more detail over the next two lectures. The first, occurring next time, is on global trade and finance, in which we talk a little bit more about global trade and finance. And then next week we actually delve into economic development and poverty alleviation. So for the section on global trade and finance, I want you to read, it's just a short selection in your Lamy textbook, 274 through 284. And now that we've laid out the process by which economic globalization was made, and it didn't just happen, it was crafted and it was made through policy, I want you to think about what has been gained as a result of economic globalization, what has been lost, and what is the next step for the global economy. So 50 or 60 years ago, nobody could have imagined that there would be this process of integration and kind of global expansion of trade. And it's now that has happened and that's kind of crystallized, I want you to think, into the future. What do you see as the future for the global economy? Where can we go from here now that we have this truly global system? Maybe the next step is retraction. Maybe the scale has simply become too large and there's lots of problems with it. Maybe it's something else. Maybe there are ways in which we could become further integrated. But I want you to think about that question for next time. Okay, so I'll stop there and see you guys next time.